So today we're going to paint the Ravenwing Darkshroud, and as the miniature is supposed to be black, I've obviously painted it with a black undercoat. Because we're relying on the undercoat as the primary coverage of the miniature, which is going to stay that original colour, I actually undercoated it twice, therefore giving it a bit more durability in terms of physical contact. And you'll also notice that there's a couple of parts of the miniature which aren't attached at the moment, mainly the Space Marines themselves. And to make things easier later on, I've put some blue tack on the areas where the upper part of the Space Marine is going to connect it to the lower part, and this way when we glue it later on it'll give a good connection. For the first coat of paint, I'm only covering the top surfaces or the top upmost plates of the vehicle, and I'm doing this with Corvus Black and applying it with the side of my brush. Therefore, any deeper areas, the paint won't go into those areas. And the Corvus Black was also used to cover the edges of the armour of the vehicle. Next, Scaven Blight Deans was used, and this time I'm only covering the edges. I'm not going to cover the top plate. The intent was to make the top plate slightly lighter, but I don't want to make it too light. It's still primarily supposed to be looking dark. It's still supposed to be looking black. Mechanicus Standard Grey is the last highlight I'm using for the black of the vehicle, and this time round I'm using this to apply around the edges, but I'm only applying it to the edges where originally I applied the Corvus Black. So basically it's for the upmost plates, and therefore it makes the upmost plates look just slightly lighter on the highlights than the other areas, but primarily it's still giving it a nice black look. For the silver areas, I've chose to focus on the engines. After all, I can't show everything in the video, it would take too long. So all of the silver areas, I started off with Lead Belcher, and then I've used Iron Breaker to cover the top half of the engine on the outside part of the engine, but also that little piece in the centre. And then lastly I used some Runefang steel, and for the little piece in the centre I literally just put a very fine line across the so it creates a divide between the darker part of the silver at the bottom and the lighter silver at the top. And this just helps to represent where there's more light coming from above than what there would be from below. And for the metallic parts that are on the main vehicle, I didn't apply any null oil. I wanted to keep it just plain silver because it's already quite dark anyway, and the null oil would just dilute the colour down even further. For the 4 primary exhausts, the way I've painted these, I've done a video on this before, so I will leave a link in the description for that. And there's 2 extra exhausts on the back of the vehicle, which I would presume would be a booster exhaust. I started off with painting it white first because of the black underpaint, and then after the white was dry, Lothorn blue was painted into the area to give it the colour I want. And then once that was dry, White Scar was thinned down with water, and by thinning it down with the water it will make it want to sink into the recesses, and you might maybe need a second coat, but the idea was to imply that there was heat coming from the back, hence why you want the white into the recesses to show that extra heat. Although for this miniature I want it primarily to be black, being it's supposed to be black, I wanted to inject some colour into some areas of it just to try and make it stand out a little bit. So for this part of the miniature I decided to paint it so it looks like a large piece of green marble. And I started off with a couple of coats of Caliban green first, just to make sure you got a good base coat. In fact, what you can do is you paint the first coat of the Caliban green, and when it's dry, you can, instead of trying to paint the whole area in one go, pick one area, apply the Caliban green, and then use Sybarite green and literally wet blend it into the Caliban green. And this way the colour isn't too much of a contrast between the two layers of colour. And once this is dry, I painted in the veins with moot green. And then obviously this needs to be dry, but later on we end up putting a gloss varnish over it, and that'll give it a nice shiny marble look. Again, to try and create a bit of a contrast between the Space Marines themselves and the actual miniature, where the primary part of the miniature had greys for the highlights. For the Space Marines, I just used Corax white around the edges to pick out the armour and make it stand out. And for the symbol here on the shoulder pad, I used the Corax white first, and then I used white scar just to pick out some of the highlights and give it a bit more depth. Again, to separate the Space Marines from the main vehicle, the Space Marines had the same silvers applied as the vehicle did, only with the Space Marines I applied null oil afterwards to darken them down slightly and give them that slight difference. The only slight difference here is for the barrels of the weapon. Instead of covering the entire barrel, I deliberately put the null oil just down the crevice, down in between the barrels. I didn't want to dull the entire thing down. Generally speaking, I wanted to keep the barrels quite light. Again, to inject a little bit of colour into this miniature, I started off by using a light red colour on the end of the weapon. When this was dry, I used Flaskets yellow and I applied that over the area, but the very tip of the area where the red is, I left a little bit of the red into those recesses in between the barrels. And then later on, I used a little bit of Phalanx yellow just to pick out the very edges and give a slight bit of extra highlight. For these nodules on the underside of the vehicle, I'm not certain what they're supposed to be, but I decided to think that they're supposed to be lights. So I started off with Warboss green, and afterwards I used Hexwraith flame to cover these parts 2/3 of the way down. And I also used these two colours later on for, there's an area where it looks like it's stained glass window, and I thought these two colours would give that area a bit of a nice glow about them. There's quite a lot of buttons and dials on this miniature, and initially I started off by painting them Venetian grey, or I used an old pot of snakebite leather, which is a mid-tone brown colour. Once this has had time to dry, for the areas where I applied the Venetian grey, I applied a blue shade, and for the areas where I initially had the brown, I watered down some Flaskets yellow and put that onto those areas. So it gives me a nice blue and yellow combination for the buttons, which stands out quite nicely with the black. Now a gloss varnish is being applied to the marble area here, and also I'm going to apply this gloss varnish to all of the button areas and the stained glass window area, and obviously I'm going to do it on things like the eye lenses for the Space Marines themselves as well. This part I almost forgot to do, which is the lights on the fins next to the exhausts. And for the right side, I started off with Venetian grey first, and I then used a green shade over the area. And for the left side, I started off with Upshapti bone. I then applied a red shade over the area, and once they're dry, I did find the red shade needed a second coat, but once they're dry, I put a gloss varnish over these lights. And now you can see the miniature with the Space Marines put inside, and it still looks nice and black as it's supposed to, but as you can see, I've managed to put a few little bits of extra colour in to give it a bit of life. And personally, I feel that the Space Marines stand out from the rest of the miniature, even though again they are still black. So remember to look in the description below to see the finished miniature. If you like the video, remember to subscribe, click the notification bell, and also share the video with your friends.